joining with us the Chairman of Direct and Indirect Tax Committee, CA Sunil Sanghvi, the Secretary in Absentia, CA Bishan Shah, and all the members attending this webinar from all over the India. I welcome you all to this second day of this International Taxation Series organized by Ahmedabad branch. Friends, before we start, with utmost pride and privilege, I want to wish you all a happy Gujarat Day. Friends, આજે 1st May 2020 એટલે કે આપણા ગુજરાતના સ્થાપના દિવસની ઉજવણી થશે. Plus, apart from that, friends, you might have received by mail, SMS, and also by WhatsApp the newsletter of our branch on today, the very 1st day of May. Friends, what is new in this particular newsletter and which will help you to access the same is that whichever webinars happened till 14th of April, the link of all the webinars is there in this newsletter. So you can go, you can access from that newsletter the YouTube links along with the name of the topic, the name of the speaker, so that in case you have missed out any webinar, you can get the advantage of the same. Plus, one very important announcement, friends. Presently, if we or our clients has done any investment, the question might be popping in our mind, what will be the position of our investments post COVID-19 lockdown ends? Or else, if we or our clients want to make any investment, our clients might be constantly asking that which are the sectors in which they can do investment post this COVID-19 lockdown ends. To address on this, tomorrow evening, Saturday, 4 p.m., we are having a panel discussion with eminent panelists from the sector of real estate, from the sector of stock market, and from the sector of gold and jewels from Ahmedabad itself, so that we can get the local idea of how the things are going to happen at a micro level, at an Ahmedabad level. And friends, this is powered by My FM and it is open for public at large, and very few seats are left now. So I request you all to register. It's free, so that we, the chartered accountants, don't remain outside this particular panel discussion. With this brief words, I again wish you a happy Gujarat Day, a happy learning day. And now I request Sunil Sanghvi to take the session ahead.
Thank you, panel boy. I welcome today's faculty, Sri Ashwin Vishwanathan from Chennai, seniors and friends. Today's topic, transfer pricing challenges in view of this COVID-19. We know that transfer pricing deals with the technique where parent companies sell goods and services to their subsidiary entities at an inflated price to deliberately reduce profit and the tax liability. The transfer pricing regulations were introduced in India in the year 2001. A burden of proof is on the taxpayer to ensure that any income or expense rising from international transaction having regard to the arm's length price. Thus, the primary onus is on the taxpayer to determine an arm's length price and to substantiate the same with the prescribed documentation. Now, I would like to introduce the today's faculty, Sri Ashwin Vishwanathan. Sir is a partner with EY Tax Practice in Chennai and leads the transfer pricing team over there. He has over 15 years experience of the tax consulting in this field, and he has worked with large number of companies and a variety of transfer pricing and the international tax issues. He has also worked with E&Y transfer pricing practice in the San Jose, California, USA on an 18-month international rotation. He was a part of the team constituted by our institute to revise the guidance note on the transfer pricing. He is also author of books and a regular speaker in this field. With this brief note, I welcome him again and request him to start the session.
Thank you. And a very good morning to all of you. I trust each one of you and your families are doing well and are safe in these challenging times. At the outset, I would like to thank Sunil ji, and the organizers of WIRC Ahmedabad branch for giving me this opportunity to present before you. Happy Gujarat Day. That was something which I didn't know. So happy Gujarat Day to all listeners. I'm right now based in Gurgaon, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, it is also Gurgaon Day. So I didn't know that May 1st was quite popular as a day of establishing many places. In terms of the topic in front of us, I think the presentation material has already been shared with all the participants. And I would want to spend the next 60 to 75 minutes probably speaking through some of the material that is presented there. COVID-19 is an unprecedented crisis that all of us are facing right now. I hope the presentation is visible.
Yes, it is visible.
Okay, thank you. COVID-19 is not the first crisis that humanity has faced. It will not be the last. But going into the topic, when I thought about it, I think we'll get to the unsurprising part of it. But the way I see it is that this crisis is possibly a little bit different as compared to the other crises that we have seen in the past. The reason for that is the scale and the magnitude of this crisis is far greater than what has ever been seen. There have been outbreaks in the past, there have been financial crises in the past, but today, in a globally interconnected world, the impact that we see is unprecedented. And it is mainly because of not only an impact on the supply chain, but also a significant impact on the demand side of the economy. And the restriction in terms of people movement across borders, which fuels a large part of international trade, has also been responsible for the kind of effect this crisis is currently having. Various estimates suggest that we are going to see a very, very material impact on global trade in 2021. A large number of sectors and industries have been hit. The impact on various sectors and industries and subsectors may not be uniform, but there will be some ripple effect of this crisis on pretty much everything that we can think of as a part of our daily lives. About 1/3 of the global population, which is about close to 2.5 to 3 billion people, are under lockdown. According to estimates by various international agencies, about 170 countries in the world are expected to experience negative growth in 2021. And the monetary impact of this crisis could be larger than the Great Depression of the 1930s and the financial crisis of 2008. As we speak, the crisis is still not over. I'm confident that all of us individually and collectively, will emerge stronger from this crisis. But unfortunately, at this stage, the crisis is still unfolding, and none of us have the ability of assessing what is going to be the full impact of this. To that extent, I would say that all discussions today are, in a sense, premature. We will have to see how this crisis evolves, how long it prolongs, when we see the end of it, and how quickly can the recovery be made to pre-crisis or pre-COVID-19 levels for us to really understand the magnitude of what the crisis has left behind and what is the path forward. Now, given that the world is so interconnected, and I was reading one story that the SARS crisis and the MERS crisis, which happened in the early 2000s, did not spread, even though they were more lethal than COVID-19, did not spread as much because the world was much less interconnected at that point in time as compared to 2020. One simple illustration was that Wuhan, which was the epicenter or the origin of COVID-19, in 2001 had no connectivity with many parts of the world, whereas in 2020, there are 3 direct flights each from Wuhan to northern Italy and to Tehran in Iran, both of which many of you would be aware were in fact some of the early hotspots of the COVID-19 spread. That is just to give you a sense of how people movement in this crisis and the global interconnectedness of world in terms of trade, movement of goods, movement of services, movement of money, people, intangibles, has had a very, very different and a very material impact in the way this crisis has unfolded and impacted or affected all our lives. And there it is the right segue into why and how this impacts transfer pricing. This slide 3, is quite a busy slide, and it summarizes the various aspects which are potentially impacted because of COVID-19 hitting global trade. If one were to look at the buckets into which these impact areas are, when we speak to businesses, the biggest concern that every business has today is liquidity and cash conservation. Because this has hit both the demand and supply side, businesses are fighting for survival. People movement has got impacted. Costs are rising. There is lack of demand. Supply chains have got disrupted. Third parties, from a demand point of view, have changed their behavior. Consumers have changed buying patterns. All of this cumulatively means the value chain of global trade, of which large part of trade happening between group companies has been hit very significantly. From an Indian point of view, if we were to segment the market of our clients, typically you would have a few buckets of taxpayers. You could have Indian businesses headquartered in India with possibly some overseas presence, but a large part of the Indian market would be inbound, which means you would typically have a foreign headquartered company with some presence in India. It could be either a service company or a manufacturing company or a distributor. Conventionally, and many of us would have helped our clients prepare transfer pricing documentation. The transfer pricing documentation would identify a value chain where significant parts of the value chain and the contribution would be made by the headquarter company or group companies overseas, and the Indian entity would be responsible for routine activities and would carry very minimal or limited risk. Based on such a functional and risk characterization of Indian entity, where the headquarters would be overseas, transfer pricing principles would have dictated that if there is a certain amount of profit in the supply chain or the value chain, India should be compensated only a portion of that commensurate with limited functions and limited risks. And residual profits, if any, would typically belong to the entity overseas, either the headquarter company or any other group company, which would carry the remaining business risk and be responsible for what now the OECD calls as DEMPE functions: development, enhancement, maintenance, protection, and exploitation. Though used in the context of intangibles, equally applies to any value chain where the strategic or value adding functions would be performed outside India, and India would only be fulfilling less complex or more routine functions and therefore associated risks with those. If one were to take that as the starting point, then you would typically have a large clientele which would fall into this category of either limited risk or risk insulated service providers, contract manufacturers, or limited risk distributors as a subcategorization of the inbound market. And then you would have the category of where the Indian entity is the parent entity and has presence overseas. The biggest challenge that we find in the current crisis is that all of these entities which have some kind of assured compensation in the form of a return for either its services or a return for its manufacturing activity or a return for its distribution activities have got some disruption in their business. So many companies today, because of government initiated lockdowns, are shut down and are unable to produce, distribute, or provide services. There could be again differences between various industries. Some industries like aviation have got hit very badly because the business has no demand and there is absolutely no way of providing anything to the consumer. Similar would be the case in the hospitality industry. Some industries possibly are less impacted, but there is some impact nevertheless. Those industries could be the IT industry, where definitely there is pressure, but because of technology, because of digitalization, many companies, even though they have people working from home, are still able to provide services. Maybe not to the same level of efficiency as earlier, but it is definitely not as disrupted as some of the other industries that we spoke about. And then there are some industries which are actually thriving. Pharmaceutical is one example where in one conversation with a pharma company, they said that today their capacities are actually utilized much more than what they were pre-COVID, because they are helping the government produce some emergency equipment and some emergency medicines, etc., which are the need of the hour. So this point that there could be different impact within the industry, within subsectors, is a very important point that we will come back to later, but should be considered, because in many conversations, people are generally tending to say that COVID-19 is going to have an impact, businesses have got disrupted, and therefore we should turn the transfer pricing principles on their head and ask or recommend positions which may be very difficult to defend. And I will come to examples in this regard. But the fact of the matter is that yes, there is recognition that the value chain has got disrupted. Yes, there has to be some measures taken to address the implications of these. Yes, there should be some adjustments made. There should be some revisiting or re-examination of the TP policy. But at the same time, to assume that there can be a blanket answer on transfer pricing based on one fact pattern and applying it across the board may be a big mistake that all practitioners should be careful about not making. We do see pressures from taxpayers to say that if the global supply chain is disrupted and has losses, then why should the Indian company, which is a part of that global supply chain, also not bear a portion of the loss? And there, what will be very important to consider is all along, what is the sort of transfer pricing documentation that has supported the client in defending their positions so far? Because the story there may be very different to what we are now trying to argue. That is again one point that I will delve into deeper as we move along. In general, the biggest challenges that today we are facing on transfer pricing will be that demand is impacted. So the businesses overseas, which will be customer facing, would not have significant demand. And therefore, their ability to ask for input services, goods from the Indian company would also be constrained. As a result, there will be a derived shock to the Indian entity. There will be cost escalation. People movement has been restricted. So we will see that decision making has got changed in terms of the location from which the decisions are driven, because many executives, for example, may have been traveling and are at a different location as compared to their regular business locations that they were or they used to have before COVID-19. So it is important to also analyze and understand where decisions are being driven from, the location of those decisions, and how the entire value chain, the value drivers of the business have possibly transformed because of COVID-19 before applying the transfer pricing principles to coming up with an answer of what should be the right transfer pricing policy today. The last bit in terms of potential impact areas is every situation we would normally have a contract between the parties. So the intercompany agreement would provide for some rights and obligations on the parties, and it would also provide for what is called force majeure, which is the breakdown of the ability of the parties to adhere to the contract in an extraordinary event or an act of God. And general consensus seems to suggest that COVID-19 could qualify as a force majeure event. So if one were to invoke force majeure, then can that be used as a basis, and to what extent to say that the earlier transfer pricing policy is no longer applicable and has to be recalibrated? That is a legal angle to the whole discussion, and maybe we can spend a few minutes there, and I'm sure there will be questions around that later. If one were to go back to the segregation that I had explained some time back, the biggest concern that companies have is if there was an earlier assured compensation to the Indian entity, whether it was services or distribution or manufacturing, how can the foreign principal continue to compensate that, given that either there is no business or business is not operating at the same level as it was pre-COVID-19, and the supply chain, the value chain has got disrupted, cost structures and financial structures are no longer what it was before this crisis struck. There, I would think that there could be three ways of looking at it. If in the past we have said that the Indian company is performing routine functions, is not taking any of the key business risks, is not performing any of the DEMPE functions, and therefore its compensation is limited, then in this situation where the principal has got impacted because of the crisis, the right approach could be to argue that even in this case, since the Indian company was mitigated from any of these risks, therefore it should continue to get what it used to get earlier. An example, Indian company provides services to its group companies overseas. Its compensation is based on an agreed markup on all its operating costs. Because today there is less business, one can't argue that India should get a different compensation because it was not exposed to any business risk earlier. It never enjoyed any ability to get any upside in the business if the foreign company or the entities overseas made lots of money. Therefore, it should not be saddled with any downside risk of the business also. And therefore, nothing changes. That could be one technical way of looking at it. An alternative way of looking at it could be to say, no, this is not business as usual. These are extraordinary or unprecedented times. The challenges posed by COVID-19 are very, very different than anything else. If there was a third party involved, the third party would have renegotiated the contract to say that I can't bear all the losses because of this extraordinary event. There has to be some sharing of losses. If one were to take a leaf out of that book, then you could have a situation where there is an agreement between the Indian company and the foreign principal to say that a large part of the loss could be borne by the foreign principal in its capacity as the entrepreneur, in its capacity as the principal company, which bears all the business risk. But given these are extraordinary events and there is force majeure in the intercompany contract that can be invoked to say that there has to be some breakdown of the earlier rights and obligations of the parties, a portion of the overall value chain loss could be ascribed to the Indian company. That could take different forms. It could take possibly some portion of the costs to be borne in India and not recovered from the principal. It could be a lower margin provided to the cost base, or it could be some other kind of economic adjustment to justify that some portion of the overall cost doesn't go back to the principal and is absorbed locally. And the third or a variant of this is the other end of the spectrum, where you say that because of force majeure, the whole value chain is in a loss, and every party to that value chain will bear portions of the loss equally, and therefore a larger amount of losses are ascribed to India. These are the three possibilities, and every fact pattern will be different and will have to be analyzed carefully to see what position or which of these positions could be taken, especially for companies or entities in India which are receiving an assured compensation. And today, the foreign principle says that that compensation cannot be maintained at the same level. In all of this, if you have third-party behavior or third-party data to support how things have changed post COVID-19, those reference points could definitely be used to argue that the TP policy needs some level of revision today as compared to what it was pre-COVID-19. In this regard, we are speaking to the government, and there is general recognition within the government also that there have to be some changes, some revisions to existing transfer pricing policies. But any reconsideration or revision of the policy will necessarily require strong empirical evidence in terms of what comparables are doing and what is the impact on their financial results. And today, as we speak, there is no data available to justify what is the impact on comparables. And this empirical evidence or the lack of thereof is critical because we will not see this data come out for some amount of time. So when we typically do our transfer pricing compliance analysis after the financial year has closed, we look for data of that year and say up to 2 years prior. And many times, some of the data is available just before we do the tax compliance and the transfer pricing compliance. But the databases keep updating the data as time progresses. And a complete picture of financial results of comparables for a specific fiscal year is probably available only after about 12 to 18 months after the fiscal year has closed. So when we try and do price setting today for fiscal year 2021, I think we need to be careful because while it is very tempting to say that COVID-19 has disrupted business and therefore there should be a change to the transfer pricing policy, we don't have any empirical data to support what should be that right number or what should be that right range as evidence of third parties also getting impacted in the same way. So one way of dealing with this is that companies do a monitoring on a periodical basis there is quarterly data reported of companies. One could keep looking and gathering that data to see what is the trend that emerges. And then towards the end of fiscal 2021, one could take a more prudent and measured decision on what is the right price that should be set based on the trend that is emerging from this data. But to advise or suggest very aggressive or radical measures like 0% markup for fiscal 2021 at this stage seems to be a little difficult to justify. A better approach could be that companies look at interim measures and keep monitoring how this crisis evolves, and then takes a decision on how the policy can be recalibrated to mirror what is really happening in the external market. Going back to the example that I had presented, if we were to move the discussion forward, Indian company providing services getting an assured compensation for its services as a markup on operating costs. An interim example of an interim measure could be that if that company has shut down or not provided any services in this lockdown period, then arguably it is possible to say that there should not be any markup for the portion of costs incurred during the lockdown period. There are tribunal judgments which support this proposition that when actual services are not being rendered, then there is no profit element required on that, and the costs can be recovered only on a cost-to-cost basis and not marked up by the agreed uplift required. Now, once the lockdown is released, it is understandable that there may be a lead time for production, services, etc., or businesses to resume back to the same intensity. But there would be some production, some services. During that time, maybe it is arguable to say that not all costs are recovered along with a markup. There is some level of underutilized capacity which still can be absorbed by India, and therefore you mark up a portion of the cost base or a reduced cost base and recover it from the principal. Again, these are interim measures, but this is just to illustrate that as we move forward and as the crisis evolves, the decision can't be a long-term decision at this stage. It has to be short to medium term with the ability to recalibrate it as we see more developments, more data, more evidence to say how things are changing and what lessons we can draw from that to suit our fact pattern. There is general agreement also that the value chain has to be seen from not only one perspective, but from both sides, and transfer pricing analysis has to be done from as a two-sided analysis and not necessarily from the perspective of only one party. And to that extent, when you holistically examine the value chain, there may be enough evidence to suggest that there have to be changes to the transfer pricing policy, and one may have to act accordingly. Another caution point in this is, while we definitely see a material impact of COVID-19 on businesses, it also has to be carefully examined whether the loss in the value chain is because of factors ascribable or attributable to COVID-19 in the first place. And that again is going to be a very subjective exercise. It will require a lot of business information to enable a practitioner to reach a conclusion on whether the transfer pricing policy can be recalibrated due to COVID-19's impact on the supply chain. Because if the loss is not attributable to COVID-19, then again it becomes very difficult to say that there should be changes. Let's look at some industries which were already facing headwinds. Auto industry is a very common example where the industry was under a lot of pressure in terms of margins, profitability, demand, because of differences in buying patterns, consumer preferences, and the auto industry possibly may continue to be in losses. It will be interesting to see whether it is time to argue that in 2021, if you have an auto client in India contract manufacturing for its principle, whether the entire loss in this value chain can be attributable to COVID-19. Because the loss was always there. Maybe it has worsened because of COVID-19. But then how do you conceptually or from a business point of view segregate what is the loss arising because of COVID-19 and what is the loss in general because of lack of demand or because of price competitiveness in the market? So these are again some nuances that one has to be careful about. Like I said, it is tempting to ascribe or attribute everything to COVID-19. But when it comes to a transfer pricing analysis, one has to always focus on what is the factual matrix of a client and be ready to probe and ask questions to satisfy ourselves that any position we are recommending is based on strong commercial justification and can be defended with adequate evidence when it comes to a challenge before the tax authorities. One of the big constraints I refer to for most businesses is lack of liquidity. It is again something which may have some level of linkages to transfer pricing. One of the areas that we are looking at, and there is some relaxation by the government also, where the government has said that export proceeds can be collected over an extended time period. In general, in transfer pricing, we have seen a lot of controversy on the Indian company collecting its receivable within a reasonable period of time. And there is a credit period which is agreed as per the intercompany agreement, and any delays are subject to interest. And a lot of companies, a lot of clients are saying that it is very difficult because businesses are not running as usual and collections from customers have got delayed, and therefore intercompany collections will also get impacted. So it is taking a cue from the RBI relaxation. I think in 2021, it is one of the strategies that can be success, which is to say that there is a moratorium on the interest clause in terms of intercompany receivables that may help conserve cash. And even if there is no interest collected, then the tax authorities would possibly be okay with it, given the extraordinary situation that we are in today. And a good reference point would be that if we have evidence in terms of third parties who have changed or invoked some of these clauses in their agreements with the business, we can point to that and say that even the intercompany contract has to be renegotiated or revised to that extent. And the third party behavior is a strong evidence for changing intercompany behavior. The last part is advanced pricing agreements. Our listeners would be aware that the Indian Advanced Pricing Agreement or Indian APA program was introduced in 2012-2013 and has been a very large or a very huge success for India. More than 330 APAs have got signed. There are possibly about 800-900 other APAs in the inventory, which are in various stages of negotiation. And we will probably have maybe 150-200 APAs also getting filed by June 30th, which is the extended timeline for 1920. So some companies with signed APAs would have already committed to some fixed compensation or some pricing mechanisms as part of their agreement with the government. Those APAs will have to be renegotiated. The government again has in various conversations committed that they would be open to revising APAs. They will of course look at it, discuss, see the evidence, see the information, but there is general agreement that APAs need to get renegotiated and revised, and there will be some change in the critical assumptions that underpin the APA. 2021 being an extraordinary year would see some change, and there could be different strategies with regard to APAs. You could ask for revision, you could ask for a different compensation for this specific year. You could agree to curtail the term of the APA, and those again are fact-specific decisions that one will have to see. So moving forward, these would be largely the way forward. The most important aspect would be understanding the business impact and the underlying drivers. Without a deep understanding of the business, it will be very difficult and possibly not correct to conclude what is the impact of COVID-19. Different businesses will have different impacts. Transfer pricing is fact specific, it's fact intensive. It is unlike other tax laws, deeply connected to business, and oftentimes commercial justification is as important as any legal argument that you would have for any transfer pricing position. So in discussions with clients, I think as practitioners, we would need to exercise a higher level of due diligence, ask the right kind of questions to understand what has changed, how has the value chain transformed because of COVID-19, what are those changes that have happened, how has decision making changed, how has functional contribution changed, how has risk distribution changed, before concluding on what is the appropriate transfer pricing change or revision to the policy. If the answer to this question is that India continues to do what it used to do, there is no change in the risk distribution, the functional contribution, the decision making, then and there is possibly only an impact on the cost structure because of this crisis, then I would think that it is very difficult to come up with any kind of a transfer pricing answer to say that there should be a different policy or a change and India should suddenly absorb a certain level of costs because the value chain has suffered a loss. On the other hand, if things have changed considerably, we have evidence to support it, then definitely there would be a greater justification for this. As part of this review, we would need to look at the intercompany contract. We would need to look at past transfer pricing documentation to see what is the story that has been explained. And our listeners would be aware that for the last 2-3 years, we have also extensively understood, looked at, examined, and relied upon most large groups' master files, which is the headquarter locations description of the overall value chain, its contributors, its different transactions, where intangibles are owned, which are the entities which are responsible for DEMPE, etc. Now, having all of this information from the past available with the tax authorities, it is logical for them and for us to look at all this to determine what was the pre-COVID situation and then use that as a base to say what has changed post-COVID and then accordingly decide whether there is any change required and what will possibly be the commercial justification for it, and then move on to the technical justification. Like I mentioned, review transactions with third parties and the way those have changed will have a bearing on the intercompany conduct also. So any evidence to support changes in third party behavior having an impact on intercompany conduct will be very critical and will help strengthen the taxpayer's position for any transfer pricing analysis. The impact in the industry could vary. Subsectors within different industries could behave differently. Therefore, it is critical to not adopt one single across the board position for any fact, because those may change or differ across a variety of industries, taxpayers, etc. And it will be important to again use the same standard against every fact pattern to say and conclude whether the position remains the same or different positions need to be taken. The crisis is still evolving. Therefore, any measures that clients are taking should be well documented. This is the right time, this is the right opportunity for us to insist that every company which is changing anything maintain this audit trail of documentation, correspondence, scenario building, and put all of this together to strengthen and fortify the position and justification for the change. It is a very common experience that many of us would have had with clients where we are always trying to defend positions post facto and are trying to look for documentation after the fact to support something that happened before. In this case, since things are changing, things are so dynamic, we should insist with clients that this is the right time for credible documentation to be put together. Let's put all of that together. Let's keep all of that ready so that we have a very strong evidence trail set out right at this time, and we don't need to look for it 3 years down the line when audits happen, because by then people would have changed, systems would have changed, people would have forgotten what happened. So it is better to have a proactive approach. The last point is that I don't think there can be a long-term measure which can be taken with certainty at this point in time. Measures taken have to be a combination. There could be some measures which are interim and are capable of being revised and recalibrated as we move forward. There could be medium-term measures, and then any long-term measure will possibly have to be taken only once we know what is going to be the future and once we've seen the end of the crisis. Maybe we will have to reimagine business in many sectors, and that could require some long-term changes. But I think at this time, it is a little premature to get there. These would be my concluding thoughts. In general, I agree that transfer pricing will undergo some change. There will be a material impact on businesses for 2021 and beyond. But in recommending any kind of transfer pricing position, we have to go back to the basics. We will have to do a well-documented, intensive and diligent fact-finding exercise. Every fact pattern we will face will be different in some way or the other, and therefore we can't have any one-size-fits-all answer. Impact will be different for different taxpayers. Right now, I would say that empirical evidence to support any transfer pricing position with certainty is lacking. So we need to be careful. One way of extrapolating some results is to go back and look at what happened during the financial crisis of 2008 and what was the subsequent impact. How did financial results move? But that is one way of maybe applying some kind of discount factor to profitability results, etc. But while that option is there, I would still think that it is not foolproof, because this crisis, like I mentioned at the beginning, is very, very different as compared to the financial crisis of 2008. And the scale and magnitude of COVID-19 is very different. So we may actually end up seeing a very different impact in this case as compared to what was there in the past. But that is definitely a reference point. Third-party behavior is very critical. To the extent possible, we should gather and insist that companies gather information on how third-party behavior has changed in their businesses and try and see how that can be suitably referenced for changing intercompany behavior. And then finally, credible documentation and data is critical because ultimately, if you were to look at the tax authorities, they are also grappling with the same dilemma as to how they can look at prescribing any position when there is no data currently available. And this was mainly in the context of the safe harbor rules, which have to be notified. And the government is, and the general industry ask is that the safe harbor rules be revised downward because of COVID-19. But the government currently is thinking as to what can be the justification, because they don't currently have any empirical evidence to support a downward trend. So those are some aspects which both governments and taxpayers and tax practitioners are struggling with. We will need to think of out of the box solutions. We will need to co-develop new things, new ideas as we move forward, because these are not tested. These are unprecedented times. We've never seen anything like this. So there will be that room for new creative ideas, including types of economic adjustments, what can be adjusted for, etc. So those are some things where data and documentation will be critical. Documentation to support the rationale for it, and data to support the quantification of it. With this, I will pause, and I'm happy to take up any questions. So Sunil ji, Fenel ji,
Yeah,
if
thank
there
you
are
very much,
questions, I
Ashwin
can take it up.
Ashwin, kindly can you focus on the documentation, the type of documentation that would be required? Certain talks on that to
Sure.
substantiate.
Sure. So examples of documentation is, so let me take an example of a taxpayer, a live client that we are handling, which is into
Yes.
contract manufacturing of apparel. So for contract manufacturing of apparel, they're saying that their production site is locked down, they can't produce. And this company provides products which are sold in the US market. And the foreign principle is saying that because the US market is shut down. These products are typically sold in retail outlets, in malls, etc. All of that is shut down. So the foreign principle is saying that there is no production, there is no demand from the customer. And therefore, here there is no production. The foreign principle is saying there's no demand from the customer. The customer is saying, I don't have any demand from the eventual consumer. And therefore, if one were to take this and say that, okay, I need a change in my transfer pricing, my suggestion would be that while all of these are facts, what is the documentation supporting it? So the company, we have recommended the company give us this documentation. There should be email correspondence between the customer and the foreign principal to see what is the impact. Similarly, there should be documentation between the foreign principal and the Indian manufacturer to say that, I don't have capacity, I don't have demand. This year I will be able to order only, so if last year I had ordered 100 as an example, this year I can only order 40 units because, there is no demand. So that sort of correspondence, that sort of information, email exchanges, or that sort of documentation for internal management decision making would be available with the company. We should insist that the company have all of that put together and share with us. So in general, most of the communication today or most of the documentation is in the form of either emails or management presentations or management discussions, decision making, board minutes, things like those. Those could be examples of some documentation that companies should maintain, whether it is internal or with customers, to support the fact that this is all, it's not a unilateral decision by the company. It is all happening because the overall supply chain has got disrupted.
Thank you very much. See, due to this COVID-19, whether there any tax compliance will change, or let's say the determination of cost that would be affected?
In terms of compliance, are you saying the dates for compliance, or what is the context in which you are saying compliance will change?
First, let's talk the needs of compliance. That's what we are used to, let's say, in the last year and current year. Whether that would be affected, that is the first question which has been asked.
We don't know whether it will be impacted, but I think already some of the procedural dates have got extended, like PDS and things like those. So again, this is dependent on how long this crisis prolongs and when things ease out. If the government believes that things are not going to ease out in the next couple of months, then maybe there is some relaxation given. But that is, I think, a policy decision which the government has to decide, and that is possibly dependent on how this crisis evolves. But if one were to go back to some of the deadlines which have already got extended, maybe there is some dispensation given. But we'll have to wait and watch.
Secondly, whether the determination of cost or operating margin that would be affected.
So there I would say there are two parts. So financial year 1920 compliance is due this year by October. Transfer pricing compliance. Now, to a large extent, basis my discussions with various companies, and many of the listeners would also possibly relate to it. But most of the businesses have been candid to say that COVID-19 impact on 1920 may not be material. So definitely there could be some impact because of the last quarter and definitely the last 1 month. But in general, I think 1920 was a regular year, barring that 1 month or couple of months, which will be 1 out of 12 or 2 out of 12 months. So I don't think 1920 compliance procedurally it may be different, but I think it may not really see a material impact in terms of the comparable results that we see. And 2021 is where the impact is going to be. And 2021 compliance will be due only next year. And by then, I'm sure there will be empirical evidence and data to support some of the positions that we are now expecting to take.
So if salary and rent and other things, if they are not paid, that we can exclude from the cost and other things.
Yes, that is one example. So, if there is, so I think on wages, there was a government directive. Many states have issued government directives to say that nobody will be let go and wages will be paid to all employees. So, that is a extraordinary situation. Now, there could be some justification built that this is under a government directive. In the ordinary course, if I were facing, say, lack of demand and lack of production, then I would have retrenched the workforce. But because the government is saying that I don't have that ability, then definitely that portion of the cost is an extraordinary cost. So in many cases, and one could argue that those costs should ideally not be compensated, or a portion of that cost should be absorbed by the Indian company. So again, those are examples of documentation that the company should maintain. See that there was a government directive, and again, it could differ from state to state. In some states there is government directive, in some states it may not. So again, some of those things may have to be seen again on a fact specific basis, but there is good ground to say that this is extraordinary cost.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't see any other queries are there. If anyone want to post, please post within 1 minute or 2 minutes, participants. We have a sufficient time for compliance. This time it may extend another 1 or 2 months minimum, I think.
Yeah, it could be.
Yeah.
I think the biggest uncertainty is that nobody knows when this is going to end.
Yes, yes. True. I am reading one question. COVID-19 crisis came around mid of March 20. That is nearly a year end. So while doing transfer pricing report, can we take a plea that margins are reduced due to COVID-19? Will department accept the stand? And secondly, comparable companies will also facing same issues. Another question, what to do where there is already a contract between the holding and subsidiary company for providing management services, where already a pre-agreed markup is mentioned. What to do for that contract for the FY 19-20? Do any impact of COVID-19 should be given, and if it to be given, how to justify that?
Sorry, Sunilji, the first question, I think I lost a portion of your voice.
Okay.
So March,
I will repeat it again.
Yeah, sure.
I will repeat it again. COVID-19 crisis came around, that is in March 20, somewhere in the financial year end. So while doing transfer pricing report, can we take a plea that margins are reduced due to COVID-19, and will department accept this stand? That is the first question.
Okay. So again, like I mentioned, it is, I think, a factor of what comparable results show. There could be some impact of the crisis in the comparable results, but my own sense is that that may be very minimal. Maybe again, sector to sector, it may differ because some sectors, maybe the impact as such of COVID-19 may have started a little earlier in terms of the last quarter being impacted because of production, etc. So there could be some differences in sector to sector impact. But largely, I would say that 19-20, there should not be any material impact, and any justification for a reduced margin for the entire fiscal may be a little difficult to argue. And the department will also ultimately look at what is the comparable results. If comparable results show a downward trend, then maybe there is some justification. I would only be I would be only cautious to say that even if there is, say, a downward trend in the margins, the key question is that whether the downward trend is attributable to COVID-19 or not in 1920. Like, for example, I was mentioning auto sector. Now, auto sector, generally the margins have been coming down. now to say that 1920 because of COVID the margins are low, again will have to be substantiated. I'm not sure. I'm just saying that unless I can see some evidence being given, maybe industry saying or industry reports saying that COVID-19 specifically impacted the industry in a certain way, then yes, there is definitely justification. But otherwise, I would be only 50-50 on 1920. Impact on 1920 should not be material even in comparable results. 2021 definitely will see a larger impact.
So if in 2021, if pre-decided price are there, that was example given for the management service, that the contract is already there for certain markup, can we change or can it be affected due to that?
Definitely. For 2021, the recommendation is that please do look at the contracts, look at pre-agreed pricing, and institute measures to change it. If you have to invoke force majeure in the legal contract, invoke force majeure. So one other point is that if you're invoking force majeure, typically contracts will have notice to be given to the parties. So make sure that documentation also includes notice given to the parties to invoke force majeure, to say that the current agreement is suspended for some time. We can't meet the rights and obligations of this contract. Let's agree on something different. My only point is that I don't think you can have any position for the entire year at this stage. You could get into a position, you will have to re-evaluate, reassess it periodically to make sure that it matches or is synchronized with the situation externally. If things improve, you will have to change it. If things worsen, maybe you have to change it again. So those things are something which the companies should be agile enough to do. So even if one were to say that you institute a measure, it is possibly an interim measure. Companies will know that towards the end of the year, towards the end of the fiscal, they will have full visibility of the year. They will have greater visibility of information from the public domain on how things have happened, how third parties have got impacted. All of that analysis will help you finally take a decision on what should be the final result for the entire fiscal. So there is no problem in instituting interim measures. Changes have to be done. Everyone recognizes that they should be done also. Let's make sure that we do it in the correct legal way and keep all the documentation ready for it. And then also be monitoring it as we move forward so that it can be accordingly recalibrated at periodic intervals to make sure that you're synchronized to what is happening outside.
So it means we can revise or change the agreement with proper justification, basically. With proper justification.
Right.
Yeah. And one question is regarding whether there would be any changes in the tax compliance that we already discussed in section 92. We cannot, there will be no changes as such until and unless the time may be extended. Otherwise, the compliance reporting would going to remain same.
Yes, compliance reporting should remain the same. I don't think the content is going to change, but yes, definitely there could be some dispensation given for the dates.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Ashwin bhai, for giving and sparing the time. I, on behalf of Ahmedabad branch of WIRC of ICAI and all the participants, I'm very much thankful to you. It was very wonderful session, and we would like to see you again. I'm also thankful to all the participants for attending the webinar. We are having tomorrow on the residential status section 6 amendment of the Income Tax Act by CA Rasmin Bhai Sanghvi tomorrow at 11 AM. And I once again thankful Ashwin bhai. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. And thank you to all our listeners. And I'll be privileged and honored to be invited again for a session. And have a good day and please stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.